So I was thinking the other day about how the English Standard Version in many ways is actually becoming the King James Version of our day. Now, that is not completely 100% accurate. I know that some people will definitely take issue with that for various reasons. So I'm not saying this categorically that this is the case, but I am saying that there are trends with the English Standard Version that I was thinking about that really shows that in some ways it really is a parallel to the King James Version of 1611 in terms of its usage and impact. And that's what I want to talk about in this video. So there are 4 reasons that I've come up with that really explain why I see the ESV as being the King James Version of today. The first one actually has to do with its historical ties. So the first thing here is that it is historically tied. There are new translations, what we might call fresh translations, that are really going back to the original languages and have no other historical basis in the English language. But the English Standard Version is actually a revision that can trace its line back to previous translations. So the English Standard Version is an update of the Revised Standard Version. And the Revised Standard Version is an update of the American Standard Version, which is an update of the King James Version. And actually, in the preface to the Revised Version, which again is what the English Standard Version is updating, it says, "We are glad to say, with the King James translators, truly, good Christian reader, we never thought from the beginning that we should need to make a new translation, nor yet to make of a bad one a good one, but to make of a good one better." So the RSV translators are clearly saying there that they're not coming up with a new translation, just like the King James Version. And that's really interesting. The King James Version was not a completely new translation. It was actually using the Bishop's Bible of the Church of England as its base text. And from what I understand, the King James translators were told to use the Bishop's Bible text as much as possible, but to improve it. So it clearly had historical precedent. The King James Version was not a completely new translation. It was building off of previous translation. The English Standard Version is doing the same thing. So it's historically tied. And one of the advantages of having a historically tied translation is that there's continuity there. People get used to hearing certain wording. And I think that's one of the things that makes the English Standard Version so popular, is it does have a ring to it that just sounds like the Bible to people. And I really believe that's because of its historical ties. It's tied in with other translations of the past. It's not something completely new and innovative. So that's the first thing where the ESV matches the KJV, is its historical ties. The second thing that I see as a parallel between these two translations is that the ESV is inclusive of a more theologically conservative position in the overall landscape of Christianity. It's interesting, that's similar to the King James Version, although this was a different context in the time of the King James translation, where you were looking at really the time of the Reformation. But you still had people that we might call more theologically hardlined people, i.e. the Puritans. And it is interesting that one of the motivators, maybe the main motivator for the development of the King James Version, was bringing groups together in Christianity, including the Anglican Church, the bishops of the Anglican Church, and the Puritan side of the church in England. So you really have more of that mainstream Christian group in England, if you will, the Anglican Church, the bishops of the Anglican Church, but then you also have these Puritans at the Hampton Court, and it was put forth that there should be a translation that is inclusive of these different perspectives, these different groups. Well, the English Standard Version is kind of the same way. The Revised Standard Version was what we would definitely call a more ecumenical translation, at least on some level, certainly a mainline denomination translation. So that's more just broadly appealing to Christians in general. But as far as the hardline theologically conservative Christians, they were not necessarily represented very much with the Revised Standard Version. Whereas with the English Standard Version, you really have this mainline translation, the Revised Standard Version, being revised further by those who are theologically conservative, i.e., evangelical Christians. And so that's what the English Standard Version is. It's really a mainline translation with theologically conservatives informing that translation and kind of making sure that it stays within certain parameters and is something that will meet their standards of how strict a translation should be, or how, from their perspective, faithful a translation should be to the original text. So you can see really the English Standard Version, albeit in a different way than the King James Version came about, is kind of similar here. The King James Version, you had the Anglican bishops as well as the Puritan groups, and they were coming together to make this translation, this revised translation really. And the same thing with the English Standard Version. You have the mainline initial translators of the Revised Standard Version, and then the more conservative evangelicals coming along and modifying the Revised Standard Version so that what you come up with, I think, is a very balanced translation. And it is something that everybody can feel comfortable with, whether they are more in the mainline groups or they are more in a theologically conservative group. So that's the second parallel between the ESV and the King James Version, would be the inclusiveness of these different theological groups. The third parallel between these two translations is their literary quality. We know with the King James Version, clearly people felt that it had a literary quality to it that really spoke to them in English. I have a feeling that other English translations of that time period didn't quite hit home as much as the King James Version in terms of how English speakers heard it. And that's very important. It's something I make a lot of on my channel here about how something sounds in English, because it's more likely to really resonate with you if it has a literary quality that really speaks to you. As someone who reads English, if you are an English speaker, you can tell when something just doesn't sound right. In the King James Version, of course, by today's standards, it is not very modern English, but it still sounds right in so many ways. In the English Standard Version, not everybody agrees on this, but overall, you can see, based on the wide usage of the English Standard Version, that a lot of people feel it does have a really good literary quality that speaks to them. I think the English Standard Version, on one hand, is very clear, but it also has kind of a stately, traditional sound to it. And I think that really speaks to a lot of people. It really resonates with a lot of people who are English speakers. And I'm basing this, by the way, not just on my own personal perspective, but just what I've observed with Christians in general and how widely they are using the English Standard Version. And so I think the English Standard Version really meets that literary standard that you see in the King James Version. It doesn't mean that either translation is 100% perfect, that everybody likes every single way each verse is worded, but by and large what you do see is people think, yeah, when I read the King James or when I read the English Standard Version, it just really sounds like the Bible should sound. It has that literary quality to it. And the fourth and final parallel between the English Standard Version and the King James Version is that due to these previous factors that I've talked about, both translations are really broadly appealing, which I think is really what got me thinking about this whole subject, is that the King James Version was so remarkable because so many different Christians have used it throughout history. It's kind of ironic now that it's the most conservative, hardline Christians that used the King James Version, when in reality the King James Version was a unifying translation of its time. It was bringing together different theological groups. Well, the English Standard Version, I think, does the same, and it has a very broad appeal. You can see it being used in a lot of different settings. And I think that's why the English Standard Version has the best chance of being a translation that may rise above the rest in terms of usage. Now, I know there's going to be some pushback on this. It gets tricky when you're looking at Bible sales that are reported, because those reports are just based on certain outlets. They're not based on overall usage. And they're based on certain editions of the Bible. So if there is a children's Bible that is selling really well in a certain translation, that impacts the way that the sales are reported. But if you go to different churches, if you go to different settings, and you actually see which Bible translation is being used, I would venture to say that in reality, more and more churches in the last 20 years have adopted the English Standard Version. And even if they haven't officially adopted it, they've certainly seen it used in their settings, and there are probably people in their church that are using it in many cases. And as I've said, it's not just one theological group. I've seen Reformed people use it. I've seen non-Reformed people use it. I've also seen that they have a Catholic edition. The English Standard Version truly is a very broadly appealing translation. I would say more broadly appealing than any other translation, contemporary translation in English that I can think of. Now, if you think I'm wrong about this, feel free to leave that in the comments and tell me some evidence as to why you think there's another translation that's more broadly appealing. But aside from whatever Bible sales are being reported, I really do believe that the English Standard Version is probably the most widely used in terms of different theological camps, and certainly the translation I would say most different theological camps would feel comfortable using. In other words, if we did get a group of Christians together from different backgrounds and we said, okay, we're going to use a translation that everybody can feel comfortable with, I think the English Standard Version would meet that standard. So there you go. Maybe that's a good reason to call it the English Standard Version. It is kind of living up to its name in that way. Anyway, these are just some things that I was thinking about. This is not a highly technical video that I've done here, just sharing my thoughts because that's what I do on my channel. I give you a fresh perspective. If you enjoy this kind of analysis, this Christian nerdy analysis, as well as Bible reviews and different fun things that I like to do on this channel, I would love for you to subscribe, hit the bell notifications so that you know when I upload a new video. But thank you so much for taking some time to look at this subject with me from a fresh perspective.